Hi everyone, welcome back to Power and Status in Organizations. In this video, I want to investigate how individuals, dyads, groups, and even organizations act in ways that create and maintain structures. Specifically, I'm interested in the creation and maintenance of status and hierarchies within those structures. At the same time, I'll think through how such hierarchical structures, such as a fire department or even larger institutions like a profession, influence the behavior of the actors that comprise them. One way to approach the topic of status hierarchy formation is to recognize that it's often an offshoot of organization formation. People form organizations and the bureaucracies implied by those organizations in order to achieve particular goals, maintain social order, protect private property, save lives, etc. To some extent, status hierarchies may also be born from a necessity to have experts. In other words, because there are experts at the top of these hierarchies that are specialists in technical knowledge, the people that form the majority of that hierarchical structure or that organization, they have an interest in maintaining those experts because it actually makes their job easier. When they have a question, there's always somebody that they can ask. People outside of the organization, but who depend on that organization, also rely on those experts. And so seeing organizational hierarchy formation in this way bears a striking resemblance to what sociologists and political scientists and economists call rational choice theory, which is the view that goal-oriented individuals make rational choices in order to achieve objectives. In the interest of achieving our goals, we choose to follow the lead of others who appear to know what they're doing, and it's in our interest to ensure that others do the same. This is the so-called micro foundations of structure formation. Micro because it draws attention to the motives and actions of individuals, the most fundamental component of an organization or society. So the scholar Cecilia Ridgeway argues that we must look at status emergence from a network perspective, by which she means that individual attributes are insufficient to explain status hierarchies. In other words, people aren't simply experts with high status because individuals recognize them as knowledgeable. There's actually something else that's also happening and that's also important, if not more important, in creating a status hierarchy. In group settings, people often form coalitions to either grant or block status gaining ambitious people. But such coalitions might also trigger or prevent a decline in one's status too. What's important here is this idea about coalitions and a politics that are actually playing within organizations. Thus, for people who are interested in securing high status positions, their competence and technical proficiency, or what's often referred to as their human capital, is important. We know from social psychological research that when individuals simply act dominant and aggressive in organizations in a bid to attain higher status, they don't necessarily have more influence if they can't also back themselves up with a kind of legitimate, as a legitimate status holder. Okay, so that quick explanation, let's call it the agency explanation, and that is how individuals can kind of plot their way through organizations and how individuals form coalitions to deal with status hierarchies, and even some of the actions that individuals take establish those status hierarchies. But the other side of that coin is what's often discussed as the structure side. And in the structure side of the equation, we have to start with defining what structure means. And admittedly, as a sociologist, I can tell you that structure, the term structure, is probably overused. What we usually mean by structure is that it means to evoke images of literal structures, such as buildings, which encourage people to act in particular ways, right? So in buildings, there are rooms, and in those rooms, we're sort of directed to behave in particular ways. If we're in a meeting room, we're directed to sit and have meetings in that room. If we're in a hallway, it's kind of this transitional space, and the building and the architecture of the building almost instructs us to behave in particular ways, which is to walk down the length of that hallway to go to a room on the other side. So that's what a building does as a literal structure. It directs us how to behave. And social structures act in the same ways. They're less tangible, less visible. They're not built with concrete, but they have within them codes or rules that direct us to act in particular ways. Specifically, a structure is an emergent social phenomena, such as an organization, but it could also be an institution, which is something a little bit different, within which individuals are governed by rules that pattern their behavior. A number of scholars theorize that there are basically two distinct components of structures. And this, let's call it the normative component and the material component. So looking at the normative component first, Cecilia Ridgeway calls this a social ordering schema, which is a shared set of affectively tagged information that represents or implies relations between abstract or specific actors. For example, an unbiased and impersonal professionalism toward a client. A show of deference in a particular way to a high status person, a presentation of respect for the legitimacy of an institution or a position. Ridgeway draws our attention to one particular kind of social ordering schema, which he refers to as the definition of the situation. And there's a long tradition in social psychological research of talking about the definition of the situation, namely that social actors, when we encounter a situation or we're kind of out in the world and we need to figure out what's happening here. Is somebody simply coughing at the table, or are they choking? And if they're choking, who are we? Are we the person's rescuers? The second component of a structure is the material component. And the material component is referring specifically to material resources, which includes money compensation, life chances. What's important here is that both the normative component and the material component, they are both aspects of a structure. Each can be used to reassert that structure, to bolster it, to maintain it. And then in turn, that structure and the rules and norms implied by that structure, the material resources that that structure is able to help people generate, act on all of the individuals that created it in the first place. And in doing that, what they're also doing is they're creating and maintaining the status hierarchy. When we think about status hierarchies, we often think about the tangible title that is in front of someone's position and that you might see on an office door. And that's just one small artifact that gets generated out of that social structure. We should also be thinking about another sort of ideological artifact, if you will, of a social structure, and that is legitimacy. The feeling that this is the right way that this organization should be built, and that the people at the top have legitimacy because they're the right kinds of people. Now, we know from research that legitimacy is associated with assumed competency and expertise. So by virtue of having a position that is legitimate, again, that comes with the status hierarchy, you are assumed to have competency and expertise. People always will give you the benefit of the doubt. You will have more influence over others if your authority in the status hierarchy is legitimate. You will get better evaluations. Frankly, people who have high status and legitimacy get better evaluations, and they are more often solicited for advice. While we're talking about structures, I want to draw attention to a particular kind of structure called institutions. Institutions have a particular feature which is called an institutional logic. And institutional logics are socially constructed, historical patterns of material practices, assumptions, values, beliefs, and rules by which individuals produce and reproduce their material subsistence, organize time and space, and provide meaning to their social reality. That is a mouthful. Basically, the idea here is that an institutional logic is an entire way of orienting oneself, again, including the sorts of values that people within an institution will have, a sense of what is good, what is bad, beliefs that they'll have, certain parts of their logic of standard operating procedures. For example, critics of US law enforcement frequently complain that too many police organizations draw upon a logic which posits police officers as warriors instead of as guardians. This warrior-guardian binary operates as a kind of metaphor, really, for the logic, that what police are doing when they kind of want to define a situation is they're all automatically seeing themselves as warriors, which brings with it ideas of a chase, ideas of a physical struggle, ideas that will lead them to use their firearm more quickly, as opposed to a guardian ideology that what police are doing is looking for people to protect. They're standing in harm's way when no one else will do that. They rush into the building to save lives when no one else is willing to or able to. That is the guardian kind of mentality. And you can think about that as an institutional logic. And what the criticism is here is that police officers far too often operate under an institutional logic that compels them to kind of see themselves as warriors. And a historian might even point to the formation of law enforcement having roots in slavery and as slave patrols. And whatever slave patrols were doing, they weren't guardians of anybody. They were sent out to kind of hunt people down, capture them, and bring them back, which is much closer aligned with the warrior perspective than it is with a guardian perspective. One can also think of the market as an institution, and as an institution, markets have an institutional logic, and there's many aspects to a logic. It's not just one thing, but I will point out that with a market, above all else in capitalist markets, the thing that's valued is profit, making money from ingenuity. A different institution might be oriented toward a professions logic, which values professional ethics above all else. And so the kind of behavior that is rewarded is what is regarded as professionally ethical behavior. But when a market comes in and that is the logic that dominates, then what gets valued is profit. And the people who can bring the most profit to an organization are going to start to be promoted the fastest. So you can see how these logics operate within structures, and they kind of organize what it is that we all do within those structures. Basically, the takeaway message is this, that there are these structural forces that enable and constrain the behavior of individuals, or the behavior of two individuals or three or four. There are also the innovative ways in which individuals act, or innovative ways that small groups act. The task of these social theorists is to sort of figure out how it is that we can make sense of this tension when agency and structure collide. And the theorists that I've talked about today have given us somewhat of a framework to begin thinking through some of those issues. Okay, that's it. I hope I've answered all your questions about power, status, and hierarchy formation. Thanks for watching, everyone.